1944, on the Eastern Front in Europe, Nazi hordes crumbled before the armies of the Soviet Union, defending their homeland and dedicated with their allies to the destruction of the German dream of world conquest. The beaten Wehrmacht marched into prison camps in Russia. In the West, Great Britain and the United States marshaled the greatest military armada in history, threw it across the English Channel, and charged the western defenses of Hitler's fortress Europe to liberate the nations under the aggressor's yoke. Breaking out of their coastal bridgeheads, the Western Allies overran France, poured across the Rhine, and pierced the German heartland. By regiments, by divisions, by whole armies, the beaten members of the so-called master race were herded into American and British prison enclosures. In 1945, as Germany crumbled, Yalta in the Russian Crimea was the scene of momentous decisions by the leaders of the Big Three. Great Britain, Russia, and the United States met as friends and allies, dedicated to final victory, dedicated also to building the firm foundations for lasting peace through a United Nations organization. Pushing through Germany, the United States and Soviet armies met at the River Elbe. Germany was beaten, and Americans and Russians joined hands in celebration of victory. Successful partners in war, the hope flamed among all men that the United States and the Soviet Union, with their allies, would form a successful partnership against any future threat of aggression. The price of aggressive war could be seen in the heart of Nazi Germany. Once the proud capital of Middle Europe, Berlin lay in ruins. At a schoolhouse in eastern France, representatives of the German government signed the unconditional surrender. The greatest military effort in history had been successful against the forces of tyranny. At Potsdam in the summer of 1945, President Truman met with Winston Churchill and Premier Stalin. The Potsdam Conference laid the first foundations of peace and set up a council of foreign ministers to set about the drafting of the peace treaties. The Allies still worked well together. Meanwhile, the war in the Pacific reached a crescendo as United States forces fought island by bloody island toward the mainland of Japan and toward the final defeat of the Japanese aggressor. Bombed out capital of this empire again revealed the price the aggressor pays. Tokyo was a ruined city. On August 14th, Japan surrendered, and early in September 1945 in Tokyo Bay, the United States battleship Missouri was the scene of the signing of the unconditional surrender terms. A representative of the Soviet Union, which had been at war with Japan for less than a week, was given an honored place at the surrender table. On the deck of the huge battleship, General Douglas MacArthur expressed the hope of the people all over the world.
Pray that peace be now restored to the world, and that God will preserve it always.
The news of final surrender, the news that peace had at last been won, penetrated to every corner of the globe. Peace, the hope of mankind, had arrived. In every corner of the battered world, men rejoiced, cheered the end of World War II. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, the agreements reached at Yalta had begun to bear fruit. delegates of 50 nations met to frame the United Nations Charter, a charter that was to be the guarantor of permanent peace through the orderly settlement of all international disputes. From Washington came President Truman to be present at the historic signing of the charter. Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov lent his presence to the solemn and hopeful expression of man's resolution to live in peace. The Big Five, China, Russia, Great Britain, France, and the United States, led the nations of the world as they undertook to launch a rule of law and a bill of human rights upon the earth. A rule of law that no nation, large or small, would dare defy. Man's hopes were high. And so the troops came home from Iwo Jima and Arnhem, from Tarawa and Anzio, from Okinawa and Bastion, and the United States turned to peace and the pursuit of peacetime happiness. From a mighty fighting force of over 12 million men in 1945, the United States in 2 years had reduced its armed forces to slightly over 1.5 million. And the tools of war were put away, guns and ships and armor. The snarling, death-dealing planes of war were junked or destroyed. Over half the world, America's vast machinery of war was left to rust. A junk pile? Yes, but also a monument to man's hope of peace. And the great furnaces which had worked day and night to produce iron and steel for war now beat guns into plowshares and the instruments of peace. And just as the United States had converted her peacetime production assembly lines to war, she now reconverted her factories to peace and the fruitful production of goods and materials for the comfort of mankind. But in the councils of the United Nations, things did not go so smoothly. The Soviet policy of non-cooperation had been made obvious by a series of obstructing vetoes in the Security Council, action which slowed or nullified United Nations business. In one instance, unable to invoke the veto and refusing to abide by a majority decision, Andrei Gromyko, representing the Soviet Union, abruptly walked out of the United Nations Security Council. As America's peacetime production reached its peak, the United States Secretary of State awoke a quick response among the war-torn nations of the world with an offer of help. The Marshall Plan was born, and in Paris, 16 nations met to implement the European Recovery Program. Although invited, Russia and her satellites were absent. The sky was clouded as the Soviet Union bitterly assailed the offer of the United States to help in European recovery. But the Marshall Plan went forward, and funds were appropriated by the Congress of the United States to carry it through. The Soviet moved quickly to exert pressure on its border nations to cut them off from the recovery plan. But Marshall Plan aid was loaded in the United States and arrived in Europe. Food and machinery and tools and goods. This aid was symbolized by the European farmer who, under the European Recovery Program, was able to buy a modern tractor to increase the efficiency of his farm and thus contribute more food and other farm products to the economic recovery of his country. The European Recovery Program also stimulated the reconstruction of war-devastated areas. Though the representatives of the Soviet Union were uncooperative in Berlin and elsewhere, Europe was rebuilding, was heading toward normal living based on its own resources and economy. In Berlin, Soviet-inspired Eastern Zone communists engaged in a series of demonstrations, fomenting trouble, disrupting the orderly life of the city and the nation's recovery. It had become apparent that the Soviet Union was dedicated to a planned program of non-cooperation with her former allies. Then the Soviet went further. In violation of solemn agreements, the Soviet blockaded the western zone of Berlin and left 2 million citizens faced with starvation. Power failed. Industry came to a standstill. Goods piled up. Berlin's arteries had been closed off. At Helmstadt, on the border between the eastern and western zones of Germany, food for the people of Berlin was blocked and allowed to rot. Protests were ignored as the Russians enforced the blockade and in effect challenged the Western allies to do something about it. The challenge was answered with the Berlin Airlift, which wrote history in the German skies and kept an island of democracy alive in the heart of the Soviet zone. Great Britain and the United States, cooperating in the same successful way they had during World War II, maintained the Berlin Airlift against all Soviet opposition. Round the clock, and in fair weather or foul, the engines of the huge transport planes roared over the Soviet-controlled zone of Germany to bring the necessities of life and industry to the beleaguered capital. Every 3 minutes, 24 hours a day, a plane landed. At the landing fields, the citizens of Berlin labored to unload and distribute the food and coal. For 15 months, the Berlin Airlift carried nearly 2.5 million tons of food and fuel on 277,264 separate flights. Then the Soviet gave up. Their blockade was lifted. The United States and Britain had kept faith with the people of Berlin. The lifeline of supply remained open. The death of freedom in the Soviet-controlled zone of Germany led many Eastern Zone Germans to try to escape. By day and by night, German citizens fled across the border into the Allied zones to the west. Life under Soviet domination was not their choice. Soviet intentions became clearer still in Korea, where under United Nations supervision, the Republic of Korea had been established. After the defeat of Japan, at the 38th parallel, a temporary boundary had been established for administrative purposes. This boundary was never intended as a permanent division of Korea. The United Nations Commission in Korea sought in vain the cooperation of the Soviet occupying forces in the north. The Commission then proceeded with free elections in South Korea, and the Republic of Korea was established. With the establishment of the Republic, United States troops were evacuated from the peninsula. United States authorities turned over the administration of the country to the duly elected government, and the new republic settled down to the pursuits of peace. Suddenly and without warning, the North Korean communist regime launched a brutal and unprovoked attack on the Republic of Korea. Republican troops sprang to the defense of their country and tried to stem the tide of invasion from the north. It was now apparent that international communism was prepared to resort to armed force in its plan for world domination. Using Soviet tanks and guns, the communists from the north moved forward and left in the wake of their aggression the first sad fruits of conquest, helpless civilian refugees. At Lake Success, the United Nations Security Council met to deal with this act of unprovoked aggression. The Soviet Union chose to be absent. After a United Nations ceasefire order had been ignored by the communists, the Council voted for United Nations military action against the aggressor and provided for a unified command of United Nations forces. General Douglas MacArthur was appointed Commander-in-Chief and accepted the first United Nations battle flag. The port of Busan on the South Korean coast lies close to Japan, and in Japan were the only readily available United Nations forces. United States troops were landed at Busan to carry out the instructions of the Security Council and to help the Korean Republic defend itself against the communist invader. These first forces were quickly thrown into the line in an effort to hold off the communist hordes from the north. Outmanned and outarmed, these few troops fought and fell back, trading space for time. In America, reinforcements were quickly mobilized for Korea. A special brigade of Canadian forces prepared to add their strength to the forces of the free nations. Turkey sent troops specially trained in mountain fighting. The Netherlands offered troops and naval assistance. Australian troops made ready to sail for Korea. Sweden sent doctors and nurses to man United Nations field hospitals. Units of the British Navy sailed for action in Korean waters. When the appeal for peace was ignored, 53 of the 59 member countries of the United Nations, firm in their determination that this new international organization should fulfill its intended purposes, resolved to resist aggression. "53 nations have championed the cause of freedom, fully aware of the sacrifice involved. Reverses, now or in the future, will not divert them from their course." With this action has come the world's first assurance that peace-loving peoples can, through the United Nations, combine their strength to resist the predatory action of an aggressor. For the first time in history, sovereign nations banded together in an international organization dedicated to the cause of peace have taken up arms to secure that peace, carrying forward man's best hope of a free world.